In this section of the course, we're moving beyond the discussion of the very early antecedents of what we now see in the contemporary world and to the full development of what we would now call colonialism. So this week, you'll be working with a long article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which looks at the various discussions of colonialism from a variety of academic perspectives. So it's very important that we be able to know what we're talking about. If we talk about decolonizing, we have to know what colonialism means. So this proves to be, as with all definitions, quite challenging. So we're going to be looking at a number of different ideas and thinkers, and I'll be pulling out certain key points, but you'll have to work through the whole article. It's quite dense. So if you have any questions, you can just contact me. So on the first page of the article, the writers recognize immediately that this is a challenging task. It's particularly challenging to understand the difference between colonialism and imperialism, and they're obviously tightly related, but I think they're right. In getting at the root of the word helps a lot. So they start out with this, and this is, an excellent short definition: a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. So right from the start, we see that idea of domination, and we've been talking about the codes of domination, and that's what I'm trying to get at in this course, actually. We all live within these kind of webs of history, but if we can pull up and above and start to really look at that kind of master narrative or narratives that are creating the system that we're in, that becomes very important. I always think of, I was at the fort near Kingston, and they were touring us through the old barracks, and they showed us that the officers played chess and the regular infantry played checkers. And I think that's, in academia, we want to be playing chess. We want to know what those higher order ways of organizing are and where they're coming from. So colonialism is fundamentally a practice of domination, and I would add to that it includes the exploitation of a particular territory, but we'll get to that. So as they note, this is not a new phenomenon. We know that there were Ottoman empires, there were Greek empires, Roman empires, and so on. So this is not new in and of itself, but what is new is by the 16th century, as they state, colonialism changed decisively because of the technological developments in navigation. So we've already talked quite a bit about that, so I won't go into that too much, but we see a shift in the way colonialism is practiced, and also, as I've touched on, slavery existed before, but we see with colonialism a whole new form of slavery that in turn leads into racial theories that continue to operate into the present day, and I'll be talking about that more when we get into the next section. So when we look at the Latin roots of the two words, imperialism and colonialism, that helps to clarify the difference. So as noted, the root word of colonialism is colonus, meaning farmer in Latin. So that gives us actually a very good orientation. So the idea that colonialism tends to imply or include the settlement of people in the territory, often as farmers, and that's literally true in the Canadian case. I can say that in my own ancestry, on my father's side, they came as farmers, and I don't think they ever knew the history of the expropriation of that land, because they were fleeing from famine conditions, and so they weren't asking any questions. But now we're starting to look back and say, how was that land made available? So the root word farmer is actually very relevant even into the present. So the root meaning of imperialism is imperium, meaning to command. So in Britain, in British imperialism, it was understood as a system of military domination and sovereignty over territories. So in the British case, if we take India, for instance, there were never many British people living there. They just administered it, and there was typically turnover of staff. So the English very rarely lived and settled there. So imperialism looks very different than settler colonialism because, and the decolonization process looks different. You could still argue that countries like India and Pakistan are still struggling with post-colonialism, but there aren't large communities of British people still living there. as we've already been discussing, the minute Columbus set foot on in the land that is now known as the West Indies, there it became necessary to legitimize what was happening. And so a variety of different explanations emerge for why it's legitimate to colonize a territory. And this was a long-standing argument right back into the 16th century. So we've discussed the idea of the papal bulls. So the religious legitimization was always part of it. Certainly in the Spanish Empire and the French empires, it was extremely important. I would argue less so in the British case. But the idea emerging out of the Crusades that there was a necessity to convert people, and what in the article they call the Petrine Mandate, that it's actually an act of benevolence to convert people who are not Christian. So this becomes one of the strands of legitimization, and also relates back to why we see many indigenous thinkers calling for the Vatican to revoke these papal bulls. Another strand is the idea of the civilizing mission. And so this is a very complex idea. And so the basic concept being that these territories are quote unquote uncivilized. And so these Western powers are doing them a favor by bringing them civilization. So that's one strand, and this is tightly related to the idea of what was called the white man's burden. And so we see immediately race starts to come into this, culture and race together, come into this process of legitimization. We also get the concept of terra nullius, which I have been discussing already. So that idea that the land is empty and therefore open for colonization. And so depending on which empire it is and which country is doing it, they mix and match these forms of reasoning. But I just wanted to highlight these key ways that colonization was legitimized. It's important to note that right from the beginning, this process of colonization caused a tremendous amount of debate within the Western world. So there was a sense right from the beginning that any of this reasoning was on very shaky ground. So as they write, the Spanish conquest of the Americas sparked a theological, political, and ethical debate about the use of military force to acquire control over foreign lands. Particularly with the development of humanistic scholarship, we see the church was increasingly influenced by the idea of natural law as developed by theologians such as Thomas Aquinas. So it is very important to note that the Catholic Christian response was never univocal. There was never one reaction. And so many of the theologians within the church were very critical of the process of colonization. So for instance, we find the idea of natural law, those arguing that natural law stated that war couldn't be waged and property expropriated from individuals because of their non-belief in Christianity. So this was an argument that was made very, very early on and made to the Pope himself. But here we find immediately that these thinkers find wiggle room within this concept. So one of the early arguments to justify the enslavement of indigenous people in the Americas was that they had violated natural law, and this could include charges of practices such as cannibalism, idolatry, etc. So these were used as a means of justifying enslavement, even though in many ways it seemed to go against natural law. Colonists often insisted that they were introducing quote-unquote civilization and Christianity into the Americas. However, as is noted in the article, there was very little focus put on, at least in the South American case, on conversion to Christianity in the beginning. So right from the beginning, we see the emergence of what will become known as the idea of universal human rights emerging right from the 16th century with thinkers like de las Casas and de Victoria, who were very influential in terms of the Spanish colonial project. And they argued that all human beings share the capacity for rationality and have natural rights. So the next section is titled Liberalism and Empire, and we start to also find a secular discourse of colonialism, and there's increasing debate among French, German, and British philosophers around this, partly because they're all trying to get sort of a piece of the action, as it were. And I think we just really can't leave out of this discussion the fact that countries like Britain were enriching themselves beyond all understanding through colonialism. And so, in a sense, these arguments become a kind of backstop for a sort of easing of the conscience as wealth flows out of these colonies into Britain. So, French philosopher Diderot argued that it was the European colonists who were uncivilized, and he also challenged the idea that it was legitimate to colonize quote-unquote uninhabited areas. So he takes on two of the main threads that justify colonization. So we see in this period a growing idea of cultural and religious pluralism. Now, this doesn't really flower until the 20th century, and sadly it takes genocide and World War II to really bring this forward into the kind of mainstream consciousness. But we see the beginning of the idea that all cultures are equal, all religions are equal, and that's a very minority opinion, but it starts to develop by the late 18th, 19th century. So the next section looks at Marxist and Leninist approaches to colonization, and so unsurprisingly, Marxists emphasize the material basis of colonialism, so the idea of the generation of wealth out of this process. So Marx argued that colonialism was a natural outgrowth of capitalism, which was always seeking new markets, and I think this is a very convincing argument. However, Marx also argued that, for instance, British colonialism brought with it modernity, and he believed this was a positive change. It pushed aside feudal structures, and he believed that modernity was a necessary step to then move towards the revolution. So, Marxism is problematic in many ways when we're analyzing colonization, and it's interesting to see this played out in the contemporary period with the figure of Bernie Sanders, for instance. So I think in many ways Bernie Sanders is a pretty typical socialist in that way, that he really emphasizes the importance of the economy as the basis of everything else in society. And of course, it is important. There's no doubt about it. But Sanders was criticized for not fully developing an idea of race, and so he ran aground with Black Lives Matter. And so the idea of ideology and the way that these ideologies of race and so on emerge out of the colonial project is not really taken up very much within Marxism and Leninism. The next section looks at what's called post-colonial theory. This was very influenced by the seminal work of Edward Said, his most important book being called Orientalism. And Said made a very important contribution. He's certainly very important in my original field of study of South Asian studies, because he's not just concerned with the economic aspect of colonialism, he's concerned with how it impacts every aspect of culture. So that includes literature, education, and then moving us into film and so on. So that he's talking about these structures that influence everyday people on everyday life, which are not just tied completely to the economic aspect of colonialism. Writers like Gayatri Spivak and Ijaz Ahmed began to write from the perspective of the colonized. So this was often referred to as the empire writes back. And I think that's a very important point that I already stressed earlier, that at no point were these colonized people just sitting back and accepting what was happening. There was always a pushback right from the beginning. And of course, that eventually resulted in independence movements in countries like India. So Gayatri Spivak talks about the perspective of the colonized, and many of these post-colonial theorists also developed the idea of what they called hybridity, and I think this is very important too. The idea that a combination starts to occur between the ideas of the colonizer and the colonized, and so they influence each other. So ideas and concepts from the colonies also go back to the metropoles like Paris and London and so And so it's not just that the colonizers influence, the influence flows both ways. So if we just use the example of liberation theology in South America, that's a case where this Christianity is brought by the colonizer, but is completely reconfigured within South America and becomes its own understanding of Christianity that is closely impacted by the thinkings of Marxism. So I think this is an important addition, this idea that what comes out of colonization is also this kind of mixing of concepts. The final section of this article is called Recognition and Revolt in Settler Colonial States, and one of your readings is by Patrick Wolfe, who's one of the leading scholars of the study of settler colonial states like Australia and Canada. And so this section looks at a number of Indigenous thinkers who note that even the term post-colonial fails to recognize that colonization is ongoing. And so I think this has been a very difficult concept for many Canadians, because we talk a lot about this, the idea that somehow colonialism is in the past, we've moved beyond that. But in fact, many of these thinkers are saying that these structures of colonialism have continued into the present and continue to impact both Indigenous and people and settlers. I want to look now at the work of Taiyake Alfred, who was raised within the community of Kanawaki and who has taught in a number of academic settings in Canada. So his work is very important in terms of particularly, obviously, looking at the case of the Canadian settler state. And he makes a number of really important correctives to the work on colonization that has gone before. Alfred argues that meaningful change to the colonial condition requires a lasting transformation of society through Indigenous resurgence. And he goes on to argue it cannot take place within a liberal capitalist framework. And I think this is a really important argument. I note all the time, particularly among certain politicians, this idea of if only we could get entrepreneurs onto First Nations and so on, which is basically still an argument around assimilation and the idea that somehow Indigenous people have to learn the ways of capitalism and liberal capitalism and so on. So Alfred's making a very important point here, that Indigenous nations have to determine the parameters of how they want to move forward, and that includes the revival of traditional Indigenous worldviews. Leanne Batasse Simpson is another very important thinker in this field. Her ideas relate quite strongly to Alfred's. And she's written a number of very important books looking at the idea of the revitalization of Indigenous culture. Simpson, who comes from the Mississauga Anishinaabe Nation, argues that rebuilding needs to start within. And so the first part of the process needs to be knowing Indigenous history and also reintroducing or maintaining traditional modes of governance and culture. And it's very interesting to me. I saw an NFB documentary. I will eventually bring it in to use in this course, probably towards the end, that a lot of these governance, modes of governance still actually exist. So it isn't always just about reimagining and reintroducing. They already exist. We just need to recognize them. Also, the idea of storytelling. Simpson really emphasizes the traditional oral tradition, and also the revitalization of Indigenous language. I'm going to end this presentation with the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she's a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, and she's an academic, a writer, and educator, and she wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which was, for many anyway, a surprise bestseller. And some of you may have read this book. I read it recently, and it's wonderful. And what I find interesting about Kimmerer's work is that even the way that she writes the book is a reimagining of, for instance, academic study. So while she is herself a scientist, she brings in poetry, she brings in oral narrative. And so one of the key things that she has done as an educator is to take her students onto the land so that they learn from being on the land. And so we're increasingly seeing this. I know Nipissing has a number of courses that are land-based learning. And I can see very clearly this is going to be one of the very important ways forward. And not only in terms of reconciliation, but also in terms of moving us beyond this terrible crisis we're having in our relationship with the natural world. So looking to the ideas that emerge from people like Kimmerer, I think is offering us a way out of this incredible alienation that many people feel from the natural world. I just want to end here with a quote from Kimmerer, and I think it speaks for itself. Action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it is not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us.